session is going to be recorded. And we'll open it up now to committee members. Okay. See who we have. Welcome, everyone. We are admitting the committee members into the meeting from the waiting room. So we'll do that for a few minutes. But for the people that just joined, thank you for joining. We would like for you to rename yourself so we know who you are. If you can show your video, number one, and then go to your participants at the bottom of your screen. Go to your name where it says more. You can click on that and it will ask you to rename yourself. Please rename yourself first and last name so we can make sure that we know you're on the call, and for our role purposes, we have your correct information. You will be on mute for the majority of the call. We will have some question and answer periods, but for the presentation, we will mostly all be muted. This session is being recorded. We're still letting some more people in. We'll get started in about 4 minutes. If you've just joined, please go to the participant section at the bottom of your screen and click near your name, rename, and put your first and last name in so we can make sure we know who you are and you're accounted for in the call. We'd also love to see your face. If you can show your video, that would be great. And a reminder that this session is being recorded, so the recording is on right now. Just a few more minutes while we let everybody in. If you are calling in from your cell phone, please text 337-233-1010 with your first and last name so we know that you're participating by phone. That will help us a whole lot. Also, if you're using the Zoom call-in number while using video conferencing audio at the same time, make sure that you don't have both audios on, so you'll get feedback if that's the case. So make sure you just use one audio, either your computer or your phone. If you're having any issues, you can text 337-233-1010 and we can help troubleshoot any issues you're having. Again, please go and rename yourself under participants. Next to your name, you'll see rename. Put your first and last name in so we know who you are. Same if you're calling in from your phone. You can text 337-233-1010 with your first and last name, and we'll make sure you're accounted for. We'll get started in 1 minute. Still letting some more people in. Thank y'all for joining us today. We have the majority of our group on mute right now, so we can make sure that there's no background noises or distractions. Okay, let's get started. Thank y'all for joining. I'm gonna let Tim Nickel, Project Manager for DOTD, give you a little welcome and kick things off, and then we'll go through some housekeeping.
Thanks, Bree, appreciate it. I'd like to thank everyone for being here this evening, all the effort and time you put in. A lot of y'all have been involved with this project in the past, CWG and the TAG group. And so today we're kicking off with workshop number one, primarily with the structural elements along the corridor. The LCP team has put a lot of work in, put this PowerPoint together to try to draw out your feedback and get input from you. So anyway, I'm glad you could join us this afternoon and appreciate your time and your input that you put into this. So thank you. It's going to be from 4 to 6. So get ready to spend some time here. With that, go ahead, Bree. You can take it from here.
All right. Thanks, Tim. So as I mentioned, we just want to make sure again that you go and rename yourself underneath participants. You can go click on near your name, put your first and last name in so we can take roll and make sure you're accounted for. If you're calling in from a phone, you can text 337-233-1010. Text your first and last name so we know that you're calling in by phone. Also, please don't use your computer audio or phone audio at the same time. It provides a little bit of feedback, but for most part, everyone will be on mute for the majority of this call. We will have presentation and then designated Q&A where we will use the chat feature to take questions, but also unmute LCAG members so we can make sure that your question is being answered properly. So we'll go over that in a second. Just a few more housekeeping items. This is a committee member meeting consisting of the Lafayette Connector Advisory Group, or the LCAG, members of the Lafayette Connector Partners Group, the LCP team, and DOTD. We have roughly 60 people. This is a 2-hour meeting from 4 to 6, and we are planning to keep it under 2 hours or at 2 hours. Again, we'll have designated times in the agenda for question and answer. And all participants right now, other than myself and a few people that will be presenting, will be unmuted. So for the most part, everyone will be muted right now. In order for LCAG members to submit a question, please use the chat feature. So you can see at the bottom of your screen, the chat feature. Or if you're calling in by phone, you can text 337-233-1010. We will put your questions in the virtual queue. So when they come in order, we'll go ahead and answer them as they come in, but we're going to try to focus on bridge-related topics for this session, just to be able to keep on track and stay on topic. Let's see. Members of the public that are listening in, you are able to submit your questions to info@LafayetteConnector.com at any time. All unanswered questions from this meeting will be documented. We'll try to get to as many bridge-related topic questions as we can, but any unrelated questions we'll be able to document, and we can get back to you on those questions after the meeting. Let's see. There is a recording of this meeting, so it will be put on the website probably towards the end of the week. So we will be recording these sessions. You will be able to view them on the Lafayette Connector website. And again, we'll be asking for your feedback about these meetings so we can make sure that your experience in these meetings is taken into consideration and bettered for the next sessions. So with that being said, I will hand it over to Gary and Bradley to take us through the presentation.
Good evening. Hi, my name is Gary Magi. I'm the Task 8 Structure Lead for the I-49 Connector Project and part of the LCP team here. First of all, I want to thank you for your time. We very much appreciate your time, and we're also excited to present this information to you, as well as looking forward to your input, as Tim has mentioned, and the dialogue really throughout this process. So let's go over the objectives of today. Brad? So last month in June, through this introductory meeting, we briefly discussed this Bridge 101 section, right? And that's where we talked about the basic elements of bridge components, and we introduced really the structural requirements of the I-49 connector, from south to north, all the way. But today we're going to talk more about the viaduct, and I'll give you a little more of the overview, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what the mainline viaduct really is, how big it is and how long it is. And then you'll hear about the evaluation criteria that the LCP developed in concert with the DOTD input to use to provide a comparative evaluation of the structure types. And then Bradley's going to talk a little bit more about the context-sensitive solutions structure opportunities that apply to the structure, mainline viaduct structure. And then lastly, he'll talk about what kind of input we hope we can get from you. Any and all input is going to be really good input. So that's kind of what we're hoping to get from today. So let's get started. So as you recall, last month, we had a map that showed the structure from south to north there. And we talked about the different bridge locations and the types along the corridor. But today we're going to talk about the area circled in 4, right? That's the mainline viaduct. That viaduct is roughly 2 miles long, elevated, and it starts south of Pinhook, and it touches down mainline just north of the Willow interchange. The viaduct is 2 separate structures, a northbound and southbound structure, and each provide a minimum of 4 travel lanes. And the gap between the structure does vary, and that'll be for later discussion, but as it gets into the central part of the alignment of the viaduct, the gap tends to open up a little bit more, and we'll talk about that in more detail. So before I get into the slides, I want to get you into what we're calling our virtual room. And Bradley's been able to help us put us into a room that shows us exactly what you would be looking at. So as you look from left to right, you can see the south end of the project. And the interchange down there would be University Surrey. And as you scroll to the right, you see the beginning of the viaduct from the south end as it goes across and over Pinhook Road and gets into the central region and eventually works its way through the neighborhoods, crossing over Willow Interchange and touching down. So we're going to flip back and forth to this a lot, but I just want you to notice it because you'll see the map and the base of the map change from more of a map itself versus an aerial, just to help place you closer to the structure as you think about where this structure is and where the railroad spur is and so forth. And then we'll go along these little areas to provide a little more detail about the viaduct. But I guess the best news about this is you're going to have access to this after today. And then Bradley will be able to walk you through how you can, on your own time, basically scroll through this site and get a little bit more acquainted to some of the components that we talked about. So let's get back into the evaluation and the structure type. So the goal of this project from the mainline viaduct aspect is to provide an economical, safe, and efficient bridge design to serve the project's transportation needs. So what we did, we wanted to introduce and identify structure types that reasonably reflect the community and stakeholder input. We want structure types that are technically sound, DOT accepted, as well as those that are cost effective within the overall financial parameters of the project. So basically what that allowed us to do is identify 3 concrete structure types. We'll refer to these a lot as we go through this presentation: the LG girder, the LU girder, which is the trapezoidal shape in the middle there, and down at the bottom, which we'll call the SB girder, or the segmental box girder. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them and to talk about their attributes and what they are. So the LG girder is a girder type that you see pretty much throughout the state of Louisiana. It's a very common type, very affordable structure type. These girder types are precast at a precasting yard and shipped, transported to the site. And they accommodate bridge spans anywhere from 75 up to 175 feet long. So you can see in this particular depiction showing 4 lanes each way for this viaduct and approximate number of girders. And that number of girders varies depending upon where you are. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we move into the types. So if you want to see what this looks like, if you're standing underneath the viaduct, go to the next slide. You can see what that bridge looks like from underneath. So here you're standing and you're seeing this viaduct, and it's 22 feet high. And you look underneath, and there you can see the girder lines supported by 3 pier columns for each viaduct, northbound and southbound. So if you looked at it from the side, it looks something like this. So you're going to see this view as we talk about all 3 of the structure types. And I just wanted to present that to you. And that's what we talk about and mean when we're talking about the LG girders. So let's move into the LU girders. The LU girders are a newer shape developed by the DOTD, and are a trapezoidal shape to provide a more aesthetic enhancement, if you will, yet providing the functional needs. And these structure types are precast, also in a casting yard. These structures accommodate spans that are long, that can go up to 200 to 250 feet in length. But they're also used for the shorter spans too, depending upon the needs of that particular project. So if we looked from them from underneath, here you can see the girder lines underneath the structure supported by 2 columns for each northbound and southbound viaduct. And you see the tapered shape. Then you can see it on from the view standing from afar, what this structure looks like. And then lastly, we'll talk about the SB girder, the segmental box girder. And that's a really simple trapezoidal shape section. And this girder can be precast, or it can be cast in place at the project site, depending upon the needs of the project. But more importantly, it's used primarily to span longer spans, greater than 100 feet and up to 400 to 500 feet. So these structure types are a lot more efficient. And as you'll find out, they're a lot more expensive, but also present a very attractive appearance to the bridge site. So as you look to them from underneath again, you'll see the 2 box girders supported by a single column. This particular structure type does not have the cross beam or pier cap like the previous ones have. And I'll point that out as we view to go back to these slides back and forth, but it's basically a single column supporting the girder directly from beneath. So, and then from the side, you see also a very similar view, and from afar, there's not much different that the eye can depict, but I just thought I would point that out to you. So with that being said, that's kind of what the structures look like. Let's see where they are and how they look as if you're standing at the project site. So Bradley's going to go to the structure options, and he's going to point us to the design options, which is the hotspot button. And here you can see, and we'll stay on this for a while, but you can see the line girder structure type supported by a pier cap that is also supported by 3 columns. And you can do this, of course, afterwards, this presentation, but you're able to pan through to look underneath the structure. You can zoom in and out on your mouse wheel or what have you, if you want to get closer or further away, to help give you a perspective of what this bridge would look like at a 22-foot structure height. So let's go to the next type. So here we see the LU girder shape. This girder shape, it only provides and requires up to 4 to 5 girders lines versus the other LG girders, which were there more girders. And again, this does have a pier cap, as you can see underneath, supported by 2 columns for each viaduct. And so again, we're able to scroll back and forth, and we're able to see what this thing looks like as if you're standing underneath the structure. And then lastly is the segmental box, the SB girder type. And again, you can see the pier caps go away, and you've got 2 lines of girders for each viaduct, supported by single columns. And that's what you'll find. And so when you come back to this site, you know, I invite you to go through these hotspot areas and look through it, and just so you can get comfortable and try to get a feel for what it's like if you were standing underneath the structures. So with that said, Bree, that is kind of the intro to the structure types, and we're about to talk about the evaluation, but I thought maybe if there was a question or two about these structures, we're going to get into the details, of course, as we talk about the evaluation, but is there anything we want to address before we move into the evaluation?
I don't see any questions in the chat right now. If you want to keep going, maybe we can catch some questions in the next section. Okay, perfect. So as I mentioned earlier, with support from the DOTD, the LCP team developed an evaluation process. We talked about the different criteria, and we concluded really 3 criteria to be used to help evaluate these structures. We wanted to provide a comparative evaluation of the mainline structure for each of the 3 structure types. So what I'm going to do is talk about these in more detail as we go down through the subsequent slides, but you'll hear us talk about the evaluation of the total construction cost and what that consists of. We'll talk about the maintenance of traffic impacts. What is it going to mean as this bridge is getting built to the people that are traveling through the project site? How it will impact them. And that's what we're going to be addressing when we talk about the maintenance of traffic, or MOT as we refer to it often. Then we'll talk a little bit about the visual quality or the aesthetics, the appearance of these bridges, and how do they differ. And so, so we'll talk about these, and let's get into the weeds here, and let's talk about the construction costs. So what the project team has done is we have developed what we'll call construction costs, life cycle costs, and a total cost. And these costs represent the cost to build the complete viaduct and the viaduct only. And these costs assume that the structure is a 22-foot minimum vertical clearance in accordance with our ROD requirements, and also provides the 150-foot span requirement as mentioned in the ROD. So when we talk about the construction costs, you can see they vary rather substantially. However, these construction costs are a function really of the quantities and the unit costs that it takes to build the bridge, right? What it takes to build a bridge. But DOTD and the Federal Highways Administration require us to look at really the whole year or design life of the bridge, and what we'll call the life cycle cost component of that structure. So we'll take our construction costs and we'll add the life cycle costs of that to get a total cost. And so what are life cycle costs? Well, life cycle costs are basically preventative maintenance costs. These are costs associated with maintenance, coating on structures, repairing damaged bridge rails that have been impacted, replacing bridge bearings that have to be replaced after their life to expired, or replacing bridge joints that get deteriorated over time and have to be replaced. And all these costs have to be factored into the life cycle costs in order for us to
identify a total cost for the structure. So when you see the life cycle costs of the three structure types, and you see the LGs at 77 million versus the SBs at 64 million, you know, what is the difference? Well, the difference is really the number of girders that are required to be maintained for the LG girders. It takes longer to maintain more girder lines than it does to basically maintain two girder lines. Some structures perform better than others, and they have more durability components to them. Hence, they have a lower life cycle cost. But when it comes down to the end and we look at that total cost and we see the cost per square foot, we see that range of roughly, it's about a 20% delta from the LG to the SB. So that's kind of the premium that you see when you look at that. So, so let's talk a little bit more about the next particular evaluation criteria. And this is the MOT criteria. And this is when we talk about what is MOT, right? It's basically reducing temporary roadway closures. It's minimizing false work and shoring requirements, like you see on the upper right. It's also, MOT is impacts when you have a construction footprint that makes it difficult to travel through. And then also we want to think about considering the girder logistics and how long and how difficult it is to transport these girders to the project site and what impacts it will have to the traffic. So we're going to talk about each of these individually, as well as each of their attributes that they bring. So for each of these four criteria, you'll see in the lower right or lower left, kind of a qualitative score that we have assigned to the sub-criteria. When we think about reducing temporary roadway closures, we think about minimizing impacts associated when you're erecting the girders, right? These are temporary closures, as well as impacts when you do bridge inspections. You see bridge inspections where they've got the vehicles on top of the bridge and the snooper truck that reaches over the sides, and that's traffic control, and that's traffic impacts that have to be considered. So why do these three structure types vary? And you can see that with the LG girder type, with spans in excess of 150 feet, which is also similar to the length of the LU girders, is that you have longer and more cranes, construction cranes required to lift these beams. So that makes more of a footprint or an impact, requiring more temporary closure. Likewise with the LG girder or the LU girders, they also have that same length and that same constraint, but there's not as many of those as there were the LG girders. And then conversely with the SB girders, we have a reduced number of girder lengths, and these girders are able to be constructed top down from above. And I'll show more pictures of that to help describe, but really the reduced amount of girders also minimizes that inspection. So let's talk about the second sub-criteria of MOT, and that's minimizing the false work. And here you can see the LG and the SBs really got the good grades. And why is that? Well, like most typical construction for bridges, girders are placed from pier to pier, right? So there's no shoring, there's no intermediate shoring to worry about. These girders are basically placed down and you move on, right? So that peer-to-peer construction eliminates those shoring requirements. These kind of bridges, as well as the LU girders, they're often built with stay-in-place concrete panels. So these are basically concrete panels that fit on top of the beams to speed up the construction for the bridge deck pour. Okay, conversely, with the LU girders, they do have these false work requirements, the shoring requirements, and those false work requirements kind of give a ding to that particular structure type and sub-criteria score. And then conversely with the SB girders, one is able to basically transport these girders, as you can see in this photo below, really on top of the existing deck and build the subsequent span. That's one way to do it. There's a lot of different ways to do that. These segments will also be constructed from a bottom up, and I'll show a few photos of that to bring your attention to that. Then lastly of this, before this slide, is these precast segments for the segmental. They have the deck section that's basically built into the section. So basically you're able to put these pieces together and then you're able to grind the bridge deck with a grinder to smooth out the surface to get the finish and the riding surface that you need. So third criteria for MOT is structures that require reduced construction footprint. So, you know, the larger girder requirements and require heavier cranes. And that's what we'll see when we see constructing the LU girders and the LG girders. You need 2 cranes to lift a girder type that's 150 feet long. These girders basically are almost 200,000 pounds each. And the LU girders, they're even heavier. They're almost 300,000 pounds each. So it takes a big crane. And then when you're working with a segmental, again, here you see these segments that are brought up really from the bottom up through a rigging device. And it's a smaller section that weighs under 100,000 kips or 100,000 pounds, if you will. And so that's smaller crane requirements. So that's why that gets a better score. And then let's move on to the last criteria. And this is basically the girder logistics. And that's, like I mentioned before, and that's what does it take to bring these girders into the project site. Project sites that are constrained have a very tight right-of-way or have roadways that are difficult to navigate are going to be more difficult for these longer girders like the LU and the LG girders to be transported into the site. And here you can see really how big these girders can be. The one up above shows a girder that's 165 feet long. And then with the SB girder, we have these segments that it can be transported on what we'll call a lowboy, which is just a flat semi, a piece at a time. And they're more easily able to navigate into the area. So there's our sub-score for that. And if you put it all together, go to the next slide, you can just see from an MOD perspective where the LCP team evaluated the sub-criteria for the maintenance of traffic. So I've got one criteria left for you, and that's going to be aesthetics, right? That's the visual quality of the structure, right? This is, now I want to preface this by saying that all of these structure types satisfy the rod requirements with regards to the minimum clearance and the span length requirements. So when we put this particular criteria against the structure types, we're evaluating its visual quality, right? What defines the visual quality? And we took kind of a quantitative approach to do that, which is one way to do a comparative analysis. So let's talk about the span to depth ratio. And here we defined it, as you saw, if you may recall in the Bridge 101 meeting, we talked about what the span is and what the depth of the girder is and how it's defined really from the bottom of the girder really to the bottom of the bridge rail, and that is basically the structure depth for the girder. And that span to depth ratio, as you can see here, is all falls within around 20, a 20 score, which is basically optimum with regards to concrete girder bridges. Span to depth ratios that are higher, right, result in thinner structure types with longer spans. And so they may not look as good, they may not perform as well. And so that's why when we set these structure depths and these span requirements, we want to hit that optimum to provide a cost-effective structure type that is going to really be a project winner for the structure. So let's move on to the next criteria, and that's maximizing the light penetration. And here we're seeing that structure types that have an increased overhang provide a better spread of the light than those that don't. So if I look down at the bottom and I look at the SB girder, and I see that that girder has a bigger overhang where that deck overhangs the edge of that box girder, it allows more light to penetrate. Conversely, with the LU and the LG girders, that overhang is not there, and so that spread, if you will, underneath is not as good as it could be. These structures are drawn here with a 10-foot gap. like I mentioned previously in the beginning of the project. And that was deliberate because when we're in that central area of the viaduct, we're opening up these viaducts northbound and southbound to provide more light to penetrate through and open up that structure. And as well as providing that 22-foot vertical clearance. I think that's just a winner because it really helps to provide a more open area. So when we talk about openness, let's go to the next criteria, talking about maximize the opening area underneath the bridge, right? So basically structure types that have more columns are going to have more obstructions, and it's going to be harder to see through them if you're standing underneath. What you see with the SB girder type, again, right, you have a column supporting a girder. You do not have a pier cap, right? You can see between these two boxes that there's no cap, right? Whereas the LU girder and the LG girder has a cap that has to span between the columns that provide a more visual obstruction. That's not all to say that all these girder types could be built with a two girder system. I just wanted to show the contrast so you're able to see that. But anyway, and so that's where we are when we talk about maximizing the opening. And then let's move on to the next one, which is what we're calling the minimizing the number of exposed surfaces. And as you stand underneath the bridge and look up, and maybe you do, maybe you don't, you see a lot of girder lines. You see a lot of lines, right? A lot of exposed faces. And that's a sub-criteria of our aesthetics evaluation. And you know, it's a big difference between 117 versus 9 exposed faces. And that's why we scored qualitatively the way we did for that particular structure type. And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about bridges along curves, right? You know well, driving through New Orleans, driving through Baton Rouge, and you see these bridge curved ramps, and these curved ramps are supported by straight girders. So that happens all the time. So that's not a surprise. If you look really closely in the LG girder, you can see the sunlight kind of creates kind of an arched effect on the exposed face. And that's just because that's an optic effect because you're building a curved roadway supported by a straight girder, right? So that's the reflection of that. But when you have LU girders or SB girders, you're able to accommodate that curve by constructing these girders on a curve, right? So when that curve gets tight, right? When it gets below, 700 to 800 feet, the LU girder doesn't work anymore, right? It's too difficult to design a bridge like that using the LG shape, but the SB girder can accommodate that tightly curved ramp, as you can see here in that photo below. Now the good news is for the main line, our curves are not extreme, right? They're not anything that would prohibit the use of straight girders. So we're able to use all of these structure types, even though we have a curved alignments. So, and that's as it goes for the main line section only, and not the ramps. So that's what we talked about aesthetics. And go to the summary, Bradley. And no surprise, right? You can see that SB girder is more favorable from that visual quality perspective, and likewise, the LU might be somewhere in between, right? But when we take these 3 criteria, and let's get to the last slide, Bradley, and when you combine these 3 criteria, you see this qualitative comparison, right? You see how affordable the construction cost is for the LG girders versus what it is for the LU and SB girder. But then you see the advantages that the SB girder has with regards to the visual quality and the maintenance of traffic components. So our team basically took those sub-criteria, developed this particular score, qualitative score, used to basically evaluate what we thought were very feasible structure types. And quite frankly, they all our feasible structure types. And with that, Bree, I'm going to kind of stop it and maybe open it up to some questions if there are any.
There are.
And go from there.
Okay. I know that was a lot of information. Let's see. Samuel Oliver wants to know, is 22 feet height a variable in this project?
Okay. The 22 foot height is variable. The 22 height is a minimum from a standpoint of the rod requirements. We talked about this in an introductory meeting where in order to satisfy the rod requirements, we had to provide structures with a minimum structure height of 22 feet and spans of 150 feet. Okay, now that doesn't say they can't be taller. So Bradley's going to answer that maybe a little bit better here in the next few slides. So thank you for that.
And just as I got unmuted, so I'll chime in.
There you go.
Perfect.
I'm just curious if height is taken into consideration as a variable for comparing things like construction costs, aesthetics, and any of these other things, because I think it's a great system you have, but I'm just wondering, will this continue to be applied for other variables?
It's a good question. When you think about the structure height, when the structure height becomes really high, like I'll just say building in canyons and other places where the topography is very extreme, the structure type does come into play, that height. When we're in, flatlands, flatter areas, federal requirements, have a minimum requirement of 16.5 feet. And our rod requirements have kind of one-upped it per se by providing a 22 foot vertical height. And in this case, there's not a significance in each of the three with regards to the height, just for this particular location.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Tom Sammons. Can the structure have a more historical or more local design?
Absolutely. There are things that can be implemented, and Bradley is the best person to talk about that. I don't know if Bradley, you want to just chime in before you go there?
What we've been talking about so far is just the basic structural forms, right? So the LG girders, the LU girders, and the segmental. And in the following section, we're going to take you through some of the elements like pier shapes and colors and barriers and textures and whatnot that can really begin to create a connection back to the local community. And so we'll be exploring all of those different ways that we can take what is a generic structure and make it much more critically regional or significant for this particular community.
Yeah, can I chime in on that? I mean, I've seen other places and historically where the form doesn't always have to be column and pier. There's arches that historically has been done many places. Certainly in the 19th century, but always also going up into the 20th century, different kind of arch forms. Look at some of the bridges that you have in California are certainly kind of interesting. But also the markings of the columns and the piers, I've certainly seen them in Art Deco, some that are much more historical, maybe study something that's much more attuned to Louisiana. Long history of Art Deco in this. And if you look at our Capitol, look at many of the parish courthouses, they've been done in Art Deco. But there's certainly other forms that we can explore. I think just columns and pier just looks like any place else. That's just becomes very normal and doesn't suspect, certainly doesn't talk about the specialness of Southwest Louisiana and certainly the area of Lafayette.
And your comments are really, I think, well-founded and serve as a great segue to the next topic that we're going to talk about, and that is pier shapes and what can we do to affect some of these basic forms to invoke a regional style like the Art Deco or like modernism, postmodernism. And one of the things that we really are looking for from this group is feedback about what those appropriate styles are. I mean, you referenced specifically Art Deco, and if that's something that we want to draw in as a significant theme or guide for how we begin to develop some of the details of the structure, that's exactly the kind of information and input that we're looking for. So I appreciate your comments and beg your patience for just a couple of minutes, and we're going to get to some of these elements.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, Tom. We have a question from Neil LaBeouf. What is maximum span length by girder type and rod commitment to span length? Can additional maximum span length reduce amount of piers? We'll unmute you in a minute, Neil.
Absolutely. Okay, so yeah, there was a couple questions embedded into there. I'll answer the last one because that's what I remember. Can additional spans be implemented? Yes, right. You saw when we introduced the different structure types that we had span lengths, up to, really over 200 to 300 feet allowable for the SB, the segmental box structure. But what happens when we do that and incorporate those longer spans is that we need a deeper structure depth. And we want to try to keep that structure depth to an 8-foot depth maximum in order for us to optimize that structure design. Some of the layouts associated with the main line have fewer spans, yet they're the same length. For instance, the LG girder type has roughly, I'm just going to go by memory, roughly about 85 spans from north to south. Conversely, the SB girder is around 60. Okay, and let me think here. That sounds about right. So there's a little bit less of spans, and that's because we're able to get longer spans. But so that answers the question about the additional spans. Bree, what was the first and second part?
Neil, are you unmuted?
Yeah, I think so. I think, Gary, you answered a good bit of the question. I was just trying to remember what the rod commitment was to span length. And, when you talk about longer spans, deeper structure depth, I mean, are we talking major differences, like in order of magnitude, 20, 30, 40%? Do we go from an 8-foot structure?
Yeah, I don't have that number. I do know it does cost more. This span was chosen because it provides, it does provide a lot of openness as you look underneath the viaduct. And I'm not sure, maybe Steve Wallace has a history, a better history on the derivation of the 150-foot span, if it was just, pulled, from just common textbook.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. This is Steve Wallace. It kind of ties into Neil's question. Normal span would be around 100 feet, and normal vertical clearance would be about 16 and a half. And so in order to open this up, and as a commitment to open it up from DOTD, they agreed to go to 22 feet from 16 and a half to 22 feet and to create longer spans in that 150-foot span range. So that's what we've been working with from a quote rod commitment standpoint, is 22 feet of vertical clearance and then 150 feet of span length. And so that achieves a lot of the openness and helps to, just in itself, reduce the number of spans that are required. Otherwise, we'd be, 25, 30% more spans if we weren't going out to 150 feet or so. Does that help, Gary?
Oh, definitely.
That does. That does it for me. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank
Great.
you. I think we have time, since we went a little quickly, we have time for a few more questions.
Okay.
Let's see. What features beyond the basic structure must Lafayette pay for? That's James Proctor.
Okay. Well, we haven't showed any features in addition to what, any additional features. I guess Bradley will talk a little bit about some design enhancements that are alternatives to or variations of to consider. And then, of course, as we talk more in depth throughout this whole CSS process, there will be opportunities for enhancements for from appearance standpoint and so forth that that can be discussed and hopefully, you know, clarified what can be or what wouldn't be paid for.
And Gary, Tim Nickel, you may want to chime in on that one as well.
Are you unmuted, Tim?
Tim, are you there?
Here we go. Technical difficulty. Hold, please. There we
Thank
go.
you. Appreciate it. Okay, now I'm off of mute. Yeah, the question about, we're talking about who's going to pay for this, I guess some of the features or enhancements. I would think that'd be,
If I could clarify that question, maybe this will help speed things up a little bit.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, last time I went through this, the bottom line was anything beyond just the fundamental structure of the bridge, Lafayette was on the hook for. Has anything changed about that equation? Is there other funding now available to enhance or otherwise add to something to do with the bridge beyond just the basic structure and some very small cosmetic changes that
So,
Lafayette could obtain?
yeah. So yeah, the original rod showed about 22-foot height, which DOTD committed for, which we would have to pay for to construct the project. That's above and beyond what the minimal is. And there were a few other mitigation items in the commitments portion of the original rod, which was above and beyond your minimal design requirements. So going off that, I would assume we would have something similar in this supplemental rod, where there would likely be, you know, around 22 feet, which is a higher span. The longer spans, which we were using, we would be committed to, I would assume, would be similar to the original rod. So some of that, I believe DOT would likely be committing to. Things above that or beyond that would likely be, you know, LCG and MPO and whoever else cares to go in on the funding or to help with it. Depends on what type of enhancement it is and, you know, how the money is set up as far as how it can be used. So I think probably a majority or a good portion of it above, say, the 22 feet or the longer spans like we had in the original commitments would likely be a non-DOTD cost. I would suspect we would participate in some. At this point, I don't completely know because we haven't received all the input yet. So one way to get an idea of what to expect is to go back and look at the original ROD commitments from '03, and you know that was commitments above the minimal design requirements.
Thank you, Tim.
All right.
Let's see, I think we still have some more time since we saved some time from earlier, so we'll just get through a few more questions. Samuel said, I'd be interested to have input from Annie Mahoney-Fontenot on relevant neighborhood regional styles and how those should be interpreted in a peer design. And you can send your, I guess, recommendations to info@LafayetteConnector.com or reach out to one of us, and we can make sure the information is shared. But we can get back to you after this meeting if you want to speak with the Preservation Commission and get back to us. And then Charles Bull, with the girder selection, limit our options in designing signature bridge. We'll unmute you in a second, Charles.
No, they won't. We purposefully have deferred discussion on the signature bridge, and we're going to get into details here next time. But the signature bridge will currently in our design, it falls within the viaduct. Okay, and that's not to say that it's not going to be located somewhere else. And internally, the teams talked about different locations, but for purposes of presenting the opportunities, and Bradley will get into those next time, we wanted just to focus on one spot. And so the structure types that I presented here can all be adjacent or tangent to the signature type. In fact, you'll see later some of these structure types are kind of a combo, right? Where there is that girder type going through with maybe some signature elements that are provided to enhance that particular location. So it's a good question. Yeah, we're not limiting ourselves. So
yeah, so
Bradley.
So these could easily transition into any one of the signature bridges that are currently under consideration.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for right now. If we want to get back on track and go through the next section, and then we can take some more questions after that.
Okay. The next section we're going to talk about are the CSX structures considerations, or what are the aesthetic opportunities that present themselves within the context of these basic structural forms that we've been talking about. And so we want to talk about a variety of different things with you today. We want to talk about pier shapes. We want to talk about abutment treatments and retaining walls, barrier rails, and the kinds of treatments that might be applied to them. And I brought up this slide because I think it's helpful from our last meeting in the Bridges 101 to let's remember what these elements are. You know, for example, the abutment, that's the portion that allows the bridge to meet the ground or intersect with the terrain. We've also got piers and columns. We have the bridge railing, which is also known as kind of the parapet rail. We have girders, which is the main superstructure element that spans horizontally. We also have approach walls in the form of vertical abutment walls and retaining walls. And so I'll take you through some of those different elements, starting with the piers. And also let me preface all of this by saying that this really is the starting point. We have some basic fundamental forms that have to be placed on the landscape in order to be able to support this structure. So we want to make sure that we're seizing all the opportunities that we can to massage the shapes of those things in clean and efficient ways so that we're realizing the greatest aesthetic return on the investment of having to build those things. It's enormously frustrating to me as a bridge architect when I see something that's not visually pleasing that otherwise could have been by just simply manipulating the form slightly, by thinking about its shape in relationship to something else, or the simple color or texture application that might really begin to allow the structure to resonate. And also, more importantly, to create a cohesiveness from end to end. And so that's really one of the things that we're striving to do, is create this cohesive design statement that starts at the very beginning of the project and is carried all the way through. And so we're going to show you a variety of different options, understanding that none of these options represent a specific choice. So when we're showing you pier options, we're showing you different styles, different ways that we might approach this. But as Tom mentioned, you know, when he referenced the Art Deco style, that's the kind of input that we're looking for. We're gonna take all of that information back from you and massage it and put it all together in a way that creates not a Mr. Potato Head of a bunch of disparate parts that are kind of crammed together, but instead this kind of symphony of pieces that all work together. And that starts with, again, these basic fundamental forms of structure. And we can talk about the piers. And let me back up and reference this picture over on the right-hand side too. This is actually the I-49 Segment K project up in Shreveport that was recently completed. And you can see it's a segmental box superstructure. And in this case, it has this, this rectilinear form of a pier. And on it, we've got these precast architectural medallions that were placed and special lighting was provided. And those medallions were actually part of an Art in Public Places initiative where we worked with the local arts community to have a call to artists to form what these medallions should look like, what kind of representation. In this case, it had to do with music and the river. But we're also, in our conversations with you, looking for those kind of Art in Public Places opportunities. Where might we think makes the most sense to really pay very close attention to the small details of this thing? And so we've started with 4, very kind of fundamental forms, but each one of which represents stylistically, a different approach. Option 1, and I'm going to show you these in context in just a second, is this kind of rectangular, subtle, kind of typical pier form. Pier option 2 mimics that same kind of form that was used on that Segment K project up in Shreveport, with the potential for medallions or fluting, but a bit more of a rectilinear and an organic kind of shape. Pier option 3 is a much more contemporary form. This is what we're calling an inverted diamond with a flare. So you can see that it tapers as it moves from the bottom to the top and meets up with the superstructure above it. And then we've got a softer rounded column with a flared cap. And each one of these can be adapted in a whole host of different ways, but I think they represent kind of basic form. Do we like kind of the more simple and understated? Do we want something that can be much more stylistic, that might include something like Art Deco treatments? Do we want something that's super modern? Or do we want something that's just as soft and kind of gentle as it can possibly be? And so we've got the virtual room, and I also want to give you a few more details about this. We've created this virtual meeting room for this project and put our project on the table with a couple of different hotspots. You're going to get a link to this virtual meeting in addition to the presentation material that we've given you. And we invite you to go and visit this, click on the links, explore around. You can actually scroll in and out to zoom in. And we're going to continue to update this so that as we begin to explore some of the different signature bridge options, for example, we'll have those included in this virtual meeting room. Eventually, there will also be displays that you can click on with hyperlinks that will bring you up more detailed information. So this really is going to become kind of our virtual design war room, if you will, that you can visit and begin to understand not only the different elements, but how they're working in conjunction with one another. And so if we look at these different, pier options, for example, here we can see a whole host of different options, starting with, let me go back to the beginning here. Starting with, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, the LG girders with the different pier options. And the LG girders that are illustrated are a 3-column bent, is what we call it. So each pile cap is supported by 3 columns. And here we have the pier option 1. Just a second. Pier option 2, illustrated again with the LG girders, and this is that more kind of fluted rectangular form for piers with, in this case, the medallions. And those medallions might be only in particular locations along the length of the bridge, so maybe only at significant crossings of roadways or in park settings or some other kind of key elements along the length of the viaduct. That more kind of contemporary sort of triangular form, and then the circular form or rounded form. And I think these kinds of views are important. I'm going to show you another view as well from underneath, but it gives you a sense of, you know, kind of the number of columns, the height of the structure that we're talking about, the level of transparency, you know, through the structure. And then if we look at this with the LU girders, you can see now we've dropped off to 2 columns, and we've got the 4 LU girder lines for each structure, and we've got the different pier options, again, illustrated with this superstructure. And then finally, that same thing with the segmental. Now we've dropped the transverse beam that connects the columns. So now the columns go up and meet directly at the underside of the segmental box. And then I'll take you to a, if we go over here to, this is location 16, and you can click on the pier options, and here you'll actually see all of those different options illustrated where you're standing underneath the bridge. So now you can really get a much more up close and personal kind of understanding of, okay, what are these forms? What kinds of spaces are being created? And what is the combination of both column and beam and superstructure look like? And we're going to also provide you with a feedback form at the end of the meeting, a link to a feedback form. And what we're really looking for, again, is your thoughts and ideas about appropriateness and what might make the most sense, you know, for this community. So how can we begin to stylize all of these things so that we're really creating a meaningful fit with the different elements within the community? And would also like to say too that, you know, the decisions that are made about the signature bridge will also help influence everything that we're doing with regard to pier shapes and with abutment walls. So as that signature bridge element becomes more in focus, I really think it's going to help serve as a major guidepost for the forms and treatments of a lot of these other elements. So again, just a quick recap of these different pier options. And I'm going to pause right there because I know this is a lot to kind of take in, and I'd like to answer any questions that anyone may have about what this process is and how much flexibility we have, or frankly, if you have any particular, you know, initial reactions or feedback that you'd like to give us.
You want to let us know in the chat if you have any questions. We can unmute you and you can ask it. Or you can text 337-233-1010 if you're on your phone.
Well, and we'll stop again in a minute and we'll keep going through the material and we'll pause. So if anyone has any comments or questions about this particular element, please feel free to speak up. You know, another really important element that has been raised is this notion of vertical clearance. And the current design does accommodate a beyond standard 22-foot vertical clearance, but there's been a request to explore what are the visual impacts of actually going even higher. So what does this thing look like? What are the effects if we look at a 30-foot vertical clearance? And so if we go to our structure options, where we had our different VR files. And again, you can click on these and then it's just like one of the virtual home tours that I'm sure everyone's had during the COVID exercise, where you can literally click on this thing and you can scroll around and see all of the different vantage points that are available within the 360-degree view. So this is the 22-foot vertical clearance, in this case illustrated with the segmental box superstructure, and then we can compare and contrast that with what happens if that's raised to a 30-foot vertical clearance. So nothing else has changed. Superstructure is the same, span lengths are the same, column locations are the same. The only thing that we've done is actually just raise the structure up from 22 feet again to 30 feet to give you a sense of what that does underneath the bridge.
Brad, why don't you spin around to the left? and do the same 22 to 30 foot. So you can see that difference from a different perspective.
And this is a study model, you know, so, and I'll also say that, you know, we've eliminated everything on the ground plane for right now. So we're not even showing grass or dirt or anything else. And all of that programmatically is going to be developed as the project continues to develop. So all of those landscape and hardscape elements will start to be introduced in future workshops. And that certainly has a big influence too. So again, it's not just, you know, a raw superstructure standing on a blank canvas. It's gonna, a lot of how this thing stitches itself into the urban fabric is going to be defined by what are we doing with regard to landscape and hardscape and all of the other elements that are going to be introduced to the project. Lighting certainly has a big impact on that. So I'll pause right there again and see if there's any questions about the vertical clearance comparison.
No questions yet.
Okay. Another thing that we need to think about are the bridge abutments. And so the bridges do touch down. We also have approach ramps with abutments. And so we want to think about, you know, the kinds of treatments that might occur at the abutment in terms of wall treatments. And then also we'll look at what happens along the barrier rail on the structure. And so if we kind of move down here to where the bridge touches down here around past the Willow interchange. And if you visit the site, you can click on design options, and that's going to show you a whole lot of different, you know, kind of forms that can be applied to these abutment walls. And this is important, not as an individual element, but as a part of, again, this greater composition. So, you know, if we're wanting to do something that thematically has to do with nature, then, you know, maybe we want to look at sort of a natural texture or some sort of a stone texture on the face of those walls. Similarly, if we think that, you know, a very modern sort of statement, something very contemporary is important, then there are these bold geometric patterns that we can introduce that really begin to use not so much color, but shade and shadow to begin to define the planes of the abutment walls and also the retaining walls. And then also there's an opportunity to create imagery. You know, with formliners and all the formliner technology that exists today, there's a tremendous amount that we can do to begin to introduce imagery into the patterns of these walls. And that imagery can, again, also become part of one of those art in public places initiatives where, you know, we can create some placeholders and then actually have engage the local art community or local community in general to help define what is appropriate for that imagery. And then, so these are the three things that I just showed you. Similarly to that are the railings. And again, a kind of a minor detail you can see here on the segment K. We actually took the recess. We created this little recess on the back of that concrete parapet wall or bridge rail. And then that little bit of a recess and a little bit of a change in color creates this very nice kind of subtle pinstripe, if you will, that really begins to highlight the form of the structure as this long line of, you know, uninterrupted ribbon. So again, at that same abutment wall location on the virtual meeting room, we've also introduced a variety of different barrier options. And so here again, similar to that segment K, we've got the painted recess. We've also looked at, you know, a variety of different ways that we can texture the backs of the railings. And so we're not really relying on color, but again, we're relying on kind of shade and shadow to create this textured form. Or we can use a very strong sort of geometric pattern. And that geometric pattern, the one that I showed you previously for the abutment wall, was very contemporary. We can also use those same kinds of geometric forms to begin to evoke something like the Art Deco style, and really begin to allow the little details to reinforce the bigger, broader stroke moves of the overall project.
Bradley, we're losing you.
Oh, can you still hear me?
Okay, so
It's better now. You're in and out.
break and answer a few questions, Bree.
You guys are an easy crowd today. And I do think it's very important, and we'll talk about it again in a minute, that, you know, this really, we are going to be heavily relying on your thoughts and your input. And so please take time to review this information before we reconvene on Thursday. Talk to, you know, your constituent groups, you know, share with them all of these different ideas, and let's brainstorm some opportunities, because this really is, we've been given a huge opportunity to make sure that we allow this project to begin to kind of stitch itself into the fabric of the local community. And similarly, you know, the retaining walls are going to be very important. This is actually the Palmetto interchange down in Miami, Florida. And you can see here, this is that kind of imagery where they took the MSE wall panels and used a form liner to create this kind of abstract palmetto pattern that runs its way throughout the project. And
so Bradley, there was a question asked, do some of those patterns and forms perform better than others, you know, over the duration? You know, I guess the more complicated the form, the less likely it's going to be more durable, or do you have any insight on that?
You know, really the biggest thing is the tighter split face type forms retain dirt more. And so you need to be aware of that. You know, the bigger, bolder shapes don't collect dust as much. And so I think that you really need to think about these bridges, since they are designed to last for many, many, many decades. Everything that we do needs to be thinking about not only what is it going to look like on opening day, but what is this thing going to look like 50 years from now? And if it has a tendency to retain dirt, that you can actually use that to create this kind of visual richness. So I don't know that from a durability perspective, there's really much difference. They're all meeting the same, you know, durability requirements, but they will certainly all age differently. Similarly, I think that relying on shade and shadow more than painted finishes leads to a much more durable, visually durable product, because, you know, paint will fade over time. It does require maintenance, but if the basic texture and form of the thing can create the sort of visual aesthetic that you're trying to achieve, that's something that's never going to go away. And so I think that, again, as we are thinking about all of these different options and putting together what is the final recommendation, let's make sure that we kind of keep our eye on the prize with regard to, you know, durability. And I did want to point out too, you know, this is that University and Surrey interchange. And you can see, you know, its location is very close to the end of the runway. And so we're not able to raise up the roadway a great deal. Instead, we've got to recess University and Surrey as it goes underneath it. And the result of that is going to be, you know, a large number of retaining walls. And certainly the way that those get integrated from a landscape perspective is going to be hugely important and offers a tremendous opportunity. But we also want to think about, okay, well, what kinds of treatments do we want for those walls? And whether it's a natural finish or a much more bold kind of geometric form. I think, again, in this particular area, there's tremendous opportunity to think about, you know, art in public places types of initiatives where you can really use the canvas of these walls to create something that's fairly significant within the community. So that's the beginning of that's the end of this part of the presentation, but really the beginning of the process. You know, we're talking about the basic the basic forms, but we have an awful lot of other details that we're going to continue to layer on top of that over the course of these next workshops that we have. And so what we're going to do is provide you all with all of the information that's been presented today. We're going to provide you with the project link, and we also have a number of feedback forms that we'll talk about in just a minute. But again, I'll pause right here and see if there's any questions that we can answer for anyone. And certainly there must be questions or opinions or thoughts about how we can make sure that this is a significant, culturally significant project for the community.
Sorry, I had some technical difficulties. I think I was losing it on mute, but we do have some questions.
Okay.
And I believe, Charles, you might be unmuted now. You had a couple of questions, and I think that last one was answering your question, so I hope it did. And I've lost some of the chats, but it looks like there's one from Sam. Are these meetings the only opportunity for public input from the impacted neighborhood on the design element? And if so, how can we support getting their voices heard in this process?
That'd be a good question for Steve Wallace. This is the beginning, right? There's a lot of opportunities.
Right. Just so you know, the LCAG input is one of many aspects of input that we'll be getting. And we will be holding meetings directly with the neighborhoods that are right adjacent to the corridor itself. Tina, your group, and others that are right adjacent to that. So we want to get direct input from them. And that's part of one of your questions, I think, too, is getting input that you'd love for them to see and hear, you know, what they think about those structures. And so we realize that the LCAG has some important input, but there are other groups who we want to hear from, and the residents right next to it that we'll be talking to is one. Historic groups, Freetown, Puerto Rico, and others we'll be hearing from as well. And so even other groups up and down the corridor, whether it be a Willow or more the core area as well. Then we'll also have public meetings that are open to everyone and anyone to come and see similar things and be able to give us the input. So what we are kind of counting on you guys to do is help to represent a constituent group. You heard Gary mention that a while ago, and Bradley as well. We would like for you to be able to help us gather input from folks that are in the group that you represent to help us get that input. It's not the only avenue that they have to give input, but you helping us to gather that from them is certainly a good thing to do as well. So does that help answer the question?
Yes, and this is Sam Oliver. And yeah, I'm really just echoing Tina's question. I would really rather she be unmuted.
Okay, gotcha. Hey, Tina, how are you?
I'm unmuted. Thanks, Sam. So yeah, I said this when we started the I-49 Connector project like many moons ago, that I felt like we were lacking in resident participation when I know that there were voices that wanted to be at the table. And I understand that our role as being on this committee we are the folks that are taking it back to our constituents to get more feedback and flesh that out. But I think it would be helpful too for the larger committee to not only hear those smaller discussions, but to be a part of those things as well, to hear from the horse's mouth per se, what they think of this connector. To help guide our decisions when we're talking in this group, because it seems like you're asking for feedback or based on our understanding of what you're presenting. But then we now have to go back to our constituents and present this in some kind of way that makes sense to us and to them to provide feedback. So I think it would be helpful, similar to what we did with our 49 Connector, where we allowed the public to view these things, even if they don't comment, like if they can see these things while you guys are explaining it to us, because no one on this call, except for the engineers, know what y'all are talking about and this design and these things. So I think it would be helpful if we allow the community to hear this discussion and how y'all are going over these things with us in detail, to help with further in discussion and getting the feedback that you guys really do need. So when we go talk to Macomb, Visa, and Freetown and the Sterling Groves of the world, that we're getting meaningful feedback and we're not spinning our wheels, and we can actually move this project forward. And then also, while I have y'all too, the Beaver Park comment is just a quick answer. Doesn't have to go into a lot of detail.
Okay, the short answer, Tina, to your question is we, like your neighborhood, will be coming to you guys and showing you the similar things and getting direct input from you. And they can certainly give you input that you can give back to the group. They can do as others are doing today and listen in on the conversation as well. As Bradley said, a lot of this will be on the website that they'll be able to get to also. And so it's not like your neighborhood is only going to be able to hear from you or through you. That the intent is to be able to allow them several different options to be able to get input to us. And the LCAG input is one of many that we will be getting. So anyway, we're trying to accommodate that, and it is I guess reasonable and in kind of feasible way that we can, because there are a lot of folks that need to get represented on the LCAG. And so in order to help facilitate input, that's the reason we have a lot of the different layers of how we're going to be reaching out. So I don't know if that helps or not.
The other question that she had was what happens to access at Beaver Park with the additional retaining walls?
Yeah,
we haven't explored that part yet. I think that's going to be a future discussion. Is that right, Steve?
Well, the short answer is you'll still be able to get to and from Beaver Park. It's not going to cut off access in any way. In fact, it should be enhanced access today. You'll be able to get to and from the park going in all directions. We'll be accommodating bike and ped in that area as well. So the walls won't inhibit that, if that was the concern.
Okay. Let's see. One second. Let's see. Question from Charles. Don't NEPA and CSS require community input early and often? Why not broaden input at this stage? While we can represent our various groups, it is the project sponsor's responsibility to ensure full community participation. I think, Steve, you answered that just a minute ago, but if you want to.
Yeah, and Charles goes on to talk about specifically the Black community, et cetera. And that's the reason why we wanted a multi-tier approach to getting input. Was the LCAG is kind of representative group, and so we'll be getting input from you guys and through you guys from your constituents, but then we'll also the community neighborhoods and so forth that we talked about a while ago will be given input also, and specifically around the Willow Grove area too. There's a lot of features there that we want to be able to get input from, so they'll be one of the target groups that we'll be talking to as far as neighborhood input goes. And
why aren't they incorporated at this stage? Why put off their involvement further? Why not bring them in early and often as the NEPA and CSS processes specifically state as best practice?
Yeah, and we will be. It's not that they're
once again that's will be. Why not do it now at this stage? That's what I'm having trouble understanding, and I think the process thus far in this current iteration of it is very tone deaf to the needs to bring in public involvement early and often. And you have a group that is further limited from the public involvement last go round with the CSS, CWG group. Y'all have narrowed it down and then further pushing off community involvement. And I don't see why, A, these aren't public meetings, and B, why not broaden the outreach to these disadvantaged communities that more than anybody will be affected by this project.
Yeah, I mean, we may disagree on who we've got involved in the LCAG, but I mean, there's representatives up and down the corridor within the LCAG.
What percentage of the LCAG are residents within the corridor? What percentage are minority? And what percentage are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds? It's very low. And considering the project disproportionately impacts all of those categories, I think it is very irresponsible to proceed without involving them early and often. And I think it directly goes against the CSS promises and the spirit of the NEPA process.
Charles, we appreciate your comments and feedback. This is being recorded. We would like to move on to the topic at hand. And I know that our team has heard you, and we'd like to just move on, and we can address this with you at another time, offline. I know that this is a hot topic, so let's please move on, and we will get back to our bridge topics and can have further conversation on Thursday as well when we get into the breakouts. So thank you, you've been heard. Let's please move on so we can stay on task. Gary?
Sure. So Bradley, why don't we go back to the slide that prior to closing for the next steps. And as Bradley mentioned, we are, hoping, to get input as much as possible all the time, right? Where this is what we're all about. And there is a lot of information here, as Bradley mentioned. This information will be available. The PowerPoint will be available. And you can literally, scroll through the website as if you were standing there, being part of that, process. But the next thing that Bradley wants to share is really how you can help provide that feedback, right? What happens between now and Thursday? And so Bradley, I think he's got a feedback form that we're going to send out in addition to this information, just to get you thinking, right, about these particular elements, these context sensitive elements, and anything else you want to share. And then we'll bring all that information to a meeting on Thursday at the same time, and we'll go into these breakout rooms, and we'll be able to talk in smaller groups and get that input, externally, all the different breakout groups, and bring that back into a summation meeting at the conclusion of Thursday meeting. So, so Bradley, do you want to just kind of go over that feedback form that we're going to hand out?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is, it's so important that you all reach out, to your constituents, and also, take time to go back and review the information. We've thrown a lot on you very quickly today, with the hopes that you'll have some time tomorrow to kind of step back and digest all of this stuff, play around with the VR website, really begin to immerse yourself into the material that we provided. And you'll receive a feedback form for each one of these different elements that we've introduced today. Again, understanding that this is really only the beginning. And what we've asked is that you can, as a starting point, look at each one of these different elements and think about it in terms of these statements that are provided. The concept provides a visually pleasing solution while also meeting the structural and roadway capacity needs of the community. It creates a usable space underneath and around the bridge, will leave a positive impact on the community. The structure will age well and maintain positive attributes for decades to come. Again, that's that durability issue that we just touched on. and the structure type expands on opportunities for integration of public art and other community enhancements. And so if you can look at each one of these in isolation, we're not looking for, I like this one versus that one, but given these statements below, do you agree that this is moving in the right direction, or do you disagree, or are you neutral? And the same thing for each one of the other options that's provided. And then also provide any comments that you have, because that's so important. We talked earlier about, the Art Deco style, and I'll tell you, I'm a huge fan. And any opportunity that I have to introduce Art Deco details and themes into projects gets me very excited. And that's the kinds of things that we want to hear about, because that really can give us some great guidance as we begin to bring back to you more refined options and details. I mean, if you think about it, this really is just the beginning of this conversation. And the more we can talk about it, the more we can share ideas, the better, the richer this thing is going to become, the better it's going to be suited for the community. And so Thursday is the beginning of that process with those breakout sessions. They're going to be small groups. We're going to have the opportunity to really talk about in detail, what some of your thoughts and ideas are personally, as well as from the constituents that you've hopefully talked to or met with over the next few days.
Hey, we ended early. Just some information for you guys about what's coming. We will be sending an email out after this presentation with the presentation where you can find that. It's pretty large, so we're going to put it on the connector website along with the feedback form and then the link to the VR. So you can access all of those. If you have any issues, please email us or email info@LafayetteConnector.com. I think there was a question we may not have gotten to from Sam. I think, yes, I don't have it up here. Let me see, make sure that we get that answered. What's the DOTD budget for art in public spaces for a project of this kind? Let's see. Sorry, 1 second.
Unfortunately, I do not have an answer for that.
All right, looks like Tim.
Yeah, we don't have a set fixed number for art. I'm sure that'd be something we would consider, DOTD would consider, depending on what it is. I know on another project, it's currently under construction now, the New Orleans flyover by the airport. We have some aesthetics costs associated with that, with the decorative piers and sound walls that's involved over there. Some landscaping they're doing. So I know we're doing some things over there. So I would think it would be, up in the air, some consideration. I just don't have a point.
I'm sorry. This is not subject to the state's percent for the art capital outlay requirements. There's no specific set amount.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't have anything. We're using federal dollars on the other project, so. And that would be something, DOTD, LCG, MPO, would go through pretty much like any other enhancement portion of the project. And there may be things in a community, groups or people that, may want to get involved and participate with some of that.
Okay, It looks like Gary wants me to make sure I confirm the time for Thursday's meeting. So Thursday starts at 4 o'clock as well. So it will go from 4 to 6. It will be a little different of a structure. We'll have a main session, I guess, just to regurgitate a little bit of how this meeting went. And then we will break out into 6 breakout groups. So you will have time to have open dialogue with a couple members of the team during that time. And then input will be gathered based on the feedback forms that you will receive at the end of this meeting. And that will be something that y'all will discuss and go back to a larger main session towards the end to report out each breakout group's input and preferences. So that's how that meeting is going to go. We'll make sure that you have all the materials that you need for that meeting. I know Matthew asked, are we expected to provide constituent feedback by Thursday? Yes, we are asking that you reach out to your constituents and come back for Thursday's meeting. It is a quick turnaround, but you should have the information that you need, and also the recording of this will be available on the website as well. We'll get it up tomorrow morning, so hopefully that can help as well with any questions or explanation that is needed. Anybody else want to chime in from our team?
I would add that I will continue to take questions this after this week, but this is all about getting input to make it right. So.
And yes, future workshops will be held in this Tuesday, Thursday format. So I don't know if Steve or John McNamara want to elaborate on the participation for these workshops.
Yeah, we chose the kind of the 3-day workshop format initially because we thought we were going to be live, and our team was going to be in town and be able to present one day like this evening and have the next day on Wednesday to work through whatever issues may be there, and also be available to meet and then report out on Thursday what any results were and get feedback from you guys. And Matt, we do realize it's a lot of work. It's a short period of time to try to get a lot of input. And so if you're not able to get input for Thursday, or you still get some input after Thursday, then we can certainly entertain, some of those questions and et cetera in the next workshop. And so the workshops will roughly be about about a month apart, roughly. And so we do have a lot of information that we have to work through. And so we've got to do that pretty quickly, unfortunately. But as Gary said, we're open and available to the questions and comments, input that you might get even after Thursday on that particular item, whatever it may be. So John McNamara, I don't know if you had any more you wanted to add to that or not.
I don't see John on here.
Okay, well, he may,
Yeah.
May not be.
Okay. Another question from Matthew. Organization is very interested in workshop number 5 and the discussion of pedestrian and bicycle facilities. 2 days is not enough time to review and gather input on whatever options you present for these facilities that span an entire side of a city. How do you expect this to yield valuable input?
Yeah, I think, Matt, again, the bike and ped discussion will span, I think, more than just that one workshop. And we may try to introduce some things at workshop 3 as we talk about Evangeline, and then follow back up in workshop 5. And if we need to go over into some of those issues in workshop 6, I think we can do that as well. There is multiple layers even within bike and ped that we need to cover.
I think my concern here is that it would be easier for us to give input if we have more time to review the content of these workshops. And I understand that like some of it may be dependent on the workshops that precede them. But if there's already some of that material that's planned out and ready to be presented, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't benefit the project and our community if we have access to that information now rather than 3 or 4 months from now when we hold these subsequent workshops.
Right, and we're like workshop 3, for instance, right now, we're working through some of that with the state MPO, et cetera. So perhaps on specifically bike and ped, maybe we can introduce some items in workshop 3 that will tee you up for better input into workshop 5. So we definitely can try to accommodate that. That's a good bit of input. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Okay. It looks like we don't have any more questions. I think we answered all of them. Again, if you have questions in the meantime, you can send them to info@LafayetteConnector.com. You should expect an email from us right after this meeting. We will try to post the recording of this tomorrow morning, and you will be getting the presentation and the feedback form so you can do your homework. So thank you everybody for your participation, and we will see you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.